Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Okay. Right, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Lewis, now I want to ask you about option 3 reports. Can we go please to your witness statement at page 47? And on page 47 to paragraph 182A at the bottom of that page, where you say this: as a general introductory point, I did have concerns as to the quality of some desktop reports. For example, they were written by people who did not have the necessary depth of knowledge. However, if this was the case, we did not accept them and would request further evidence from the builder or its fire engineer via NHBC surveyor or project manager. We had an escalation procedure where the desktop reports would come in, get referred to me, and I would review. I would then refer these on to Steve Evans and/or another senior manager. First, what do you mean by those who did not have the necessary depth of knowledge?
At the start of the process, we were receiving what the builders thought were suitable option 3 reports, which really ended up being nothing more than the architect justifying what they had done, or in many cases just a rehash of the cladding details that had already been put forward.
Was that a problem with the architect's qualifications, expertise or experience, or perhaps instead the fact that the architect or the builder, the client, the member of NHBC, didn't understand what was required by NHBC under option 3?
No, because on the schemes that were affected, a condition had been put on the approval which stated the need for an option 3 report in line with BCA guidance note 18. That was put back by our surveyor to the builders, and they were, in response to that condition and the words in that condition, this was their submission back to us as in the way that they felt that they were dealing with that condition.
Right. I'm just interested in what you mean by the phrase people who did not have the necessary depth of knowledge, which I think you need to go back to page 47 to see. Do you mean that the desktop assessments were written by people who did not have the qualifications that you had anticipated, or that they didn't understand what it was that you wanted?
It was both.
Both. Now, as we understand it, the NHBC, is this right, would examine the option 3 reports or assessments that came in, and you were the person who did that, yes?
Yes.
Initially. Did you ever consider that the building control officers, in the case of the NHBC, your AIs, who did not have any fire engineering expertise to call on when option 3 reports came in, might be a problem?
Well, they had me to call on. I was very much involved in the business. I was not remote.
Right. What about those cases where NHBC was offering warranty only, where the BCO was external?
Well, obviously, I had no direct links to the building control that was being carried out by another organisation, no.
No.
But those schemes were then dealt with by our special risk project manager surveyors. And same thing, they were in the same London office, and I was in that office very regularly.
What did you contemplate somebody like a John Hoban, for example, of RBKC, would do when confronted with an option 3 report from the architect?
Throw it back.
But how would that person know to throw it back if that person didn't themselves have their own fire engineering expertise to the requisite level?
Well, I think the wording of the option 3, it did say about the suitably qualified fire specialists. Now, it would come down to how they interpreted a suitably qualified fire specialist. NHBC, I've explained before what we considered to be a suitably qualified fire specialist. I would not generally consider an architect to be of the right level of specialist fire knowledge that we will be seeking for an option 3 report.
No. So let's break this up. First of all, looking at your own internal BCOs, your approved inspectors employed by your BCS subsidiary, right? Let's take them. In each case of an option 3 report coming from an architect or builder, were they automatically sent to you to consider?
I would guess that some were probably weeded out by the surveyor and thrown back before they got escalated to me.
By the surveyor? Do you mean
Yes.
the building control officer?
Yes, but at NHBC we got
see.
some surveyors.
Right, so I see.
Apologies.
So was there a diktat, a direction that went to all AIs employed by the subsidiary that where they received an option 3 report, they had to send it to, in the first instance, the surveyor, and in the second instance to you?
Sorry, the surveyor, the NHBC was an approved inspector as a whole. That's the name for the company. The surveyor was the building control surveyor, qualified person that was dealing with the job.
Yeah, but that's what I thought you meant. So the way it worked, is this right, is the surveyor, as the expression you use, is the person discharging the approved inspector function.
Yes.
Right. Now, was there an instruction given to all AIs that when they received an option 3 report, they had to send it to you for approval?
Now, you still seem to think that those surveyors are the AIs. The AI,
told me.
NHBC was the AI.
Sorry, all right. There's a terminology question. Let's take it more specifically.
the surveyor-
Individuals who were carrying out NHBC BCS's function as an improved inspector, that person,
Yes.
whom I think you call the surveyor.
Yes.
Yes.
And that was the purpose of Steve Evans' email to the surveyors saying, with the guidance, the internal guidance, B500 I think it was, and subsequently enclosing a copy of the BCA guidance note and saying this is the procedure from here on.
I see. So that comes in February 2015. So before that, do we take it that there's no instruction that comes with the original issue in June 2014 of BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 to your surveyors that in each case where they receive an option 3 report, they must send it to you?
Well, there must have been because,
Well, do you know whether there was or wasn't?
well, this is what I'm trying to recall now. Because we were getting new jobs coming in and those jobs were finding their way to me. And I can't recall the official process of whether Steve or anybody had issued an instruction or a memo or an email to that effect before. But, it certainly was not the case that they were still coming in, no one had said anything, and the surveyor was left on their own to deal with it because, they were coming through to me.
Did you ever consider providing further guidance about what was required from the writer of the report, the assessment, and from the report itself? After June 2014.
We were doing that numerous times, yes.
What was the purpose of escalating an option 3 report to Steve Evans, given that he had, as he told us, no qualifications in relation to fire engineering?
The idea was that I would look at it from what had been written from a fire engineering point of view. Ultimate sign-off rested with those above me. Ultimate sign-off for building control purposes rested with people above me. And so, Steve and Diane wanted to check, carry out another check on, I assume, of what I was saying and whether they agreed with what I'd been doing. It would be more of a sense check to make sure I'd not missed anything. But that was the process that had been put in place.
But assessing the adequacy of what itself is an assessment of test data, in fact, an assessment of test data, is something that could only be done by someone with the relevant qualifications, as you have identified, yes?
Yes.
Did Steve Evans have those qualifications?
Steve was not a fire engineer, no.
And therefore, how could he possibly, reliably, even carry out a sense check if he didn't know the technical sense of what you were intending?
Well, Steve had been on the same journey that I had been on, where we'd both gained a lot more knowledge of what works, what didn't work, what was thought could work. he had a good level of knowledge, similar to what I'd learned.
But if you had failed to spot a technical error, why would he have picked it up?
It was another pair of eyes. It was not an official peer review. It was, another set of eyes.
Well, it wasn't an official peer review because he wasn't a peer, neither in at least in the sense of qualifications, was he?
No, and he wasn't called that.
No. Let's go to subparagraph B, please, on page 48, where you say this. I found the reports to be variable. Reports written by BRE and Exova tended to be the most comprehensive ones, which gave assurance that they understood the requirements of Regulation B41, and the associated guidance in approved document B demonstrated knowledge of the performance of materials in fire and had expertise in extrapolation of data from fire tests. However, and particularly at the start of the process in June or July 2015, the quality of the reports from other fire engineers lacked understanding of BS 8414 and BR 135, and in some cases had not accessed the range of tests which Kingspan had offered to make available to fire engineers. What are you referring to there when you say at the start of the process in June, July 2015? Do you mean 2015?
Yes, this was after the instruction had gone... Sorry. This was after we had gone through a list of schemes which were still in build as at the time we carried out a review of those schemes in around June, July 2015. After that was when the condition was applied on those schemes that they would not be signed off until an Option 3, Option 4 report had been received from a suitable fire specialist. And that was the time that, the condition went on all the jobs to hold them up so that they could not be signed off until this second review had been undertaken.
Right, but that wasn't the start of the process of receiving and analysing and accepting or rejecting Option 3 reports, was it?
Well, the Option 3 reports started to trickle in after, 1st of January 2014 on the jobs which were working to the later BBA certificate for Kingspan. But there were not many because most of those jobs were still at very early stages. The bulk of them came in, as I say, after the June 2015 review, after we went back through all the jobs that were in build and put on a holding condition to, get their cladding reviewed again. I
don't think I'm following this. Are you sure you mean 2015? Let's take it in stages. You say that they start to trickle in from January 2014, post change in the BBA certificate. You then put out BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 Issue 0 in June 2014, and you amend it in June 2015 precisely because BRE, Exova and Chiltern Fire had become overwhelmed by the number. So why do you say that, as you told us in the last answer, the bulk of them came in after June 2015?
Because in June 2015, NHBC undertook a review of all the jobs that were still in build, including the ones on the previous BBA certificate, and did another check back through what had been proposed on those jobs.
So are we to take from what you're telling us that there was no problem in relation to the quality of reports from other fire engineers before June, July 2015? You only began to pick those up in June, July 2015. Is that how the story went?
No, it was after June, July. The ones we were receiving before that tended to be from, the likes of BRE and Exova. We didn't have a lot of issue with those ones. The ones that we did have the issues with came in, generally after this second review of all those schemes in around June, July 2015. And that's the one where we started to see some quite variable ones. There may have been others before that, but I
follow. So I think I've understood your evidence. Is it work like this? See if I've got this right, Mr. Lewis. The trickle became a flood so far as BRE, Exova and Chiltern were concerned after June 2014, but there was no problem with the quality. But the quality problem arose after July 2015.
Yes, because we were not just seeing reports from BRE and Exover after July 2015. We were seeing them from a whole range of other bodies.
Exactly. And did it occur to you at that stage, once you started to see a reduction in the quality, that might be attributable to your dilution of the qualifications required in the second edition, issue 1, of Technical Guidance Note 18 in June 2015?
No, we took it that, they hadn't read it properly and hadn't supplied data from the right set of people.
Well, that may be the case, but that may be because they were not properly qualified to do so as a result of your amendment to the wording of option 3, which we saw this morning, no?
No, I don't think that was the case.
Let's look at a document on this point. If you go, please, to NHB 402791, this is an email run from August 2015. And if we go to page 2 in this, we can see that there is an email from you to Diane Marshall and Steve Evans on the 6th of August 2015. And let's look at it together. It's quite long, but I want to show it to you. Hello, both. I attended a meeting with Sotec on Tuesday. They manufacture aluminium, not composite cladding systems. Their system holds approval when used with rock wool insulation. They also showed me a BS 8414 Part 2 test which used K15 behind a 2mm aluminium finish, which was funded equally between Kingspan, Sotec and another party, I forget who, in 2008. It failed within 15 minutes with, quotes, flames coming off the top of the test rig, quotes. A few months ago, Sotec got a call from Kingspan telling them that they'd take legal action against them if they released the test report. My problem is that, 1, Kingspan have never mentioned it. 2, Kingspan have been reluctant to our request that they undertake a test using aluminium. 3, we've seen assessments from BRE, which are based on the terracotta and Eternit board tests, and the results extrapolated to aluminium, with the conclusion that, in their view, it should perform acceptably when tested to BS 8414. Either BRE have ignored or been instructed to ignore the earlier Sotec test, or, as it was some time ago, the current staff are unaware of it. I know that our backs are covered by BRE's assessment report, but I still have doubts about how the fire performance of a lightweight metal has been assessed on the basis of an inert organic material. And knowing that Kingspan are wanting to cover up tests which they're not happy to share, I just have the feeling that the use of an aluminium facade in K15 may not be as good as we're led to believe. And then over the page, you say, happy to elaborate more on Tuesday. Do we get from that, Mr. Lewis, that by this point, early August 2015, you yourself now had strong suspicions that Kingspan were concealing failed test reports?
Yes.
Did you consider how it was that the BRE could extrapolate test data from the two you mentioned, terracotta and Eternit systems, in order to produce option 3 reports about aluminium, while at the same time ignoring, or not being aware of, failed tests that were going on in their burn hall?
It was a concern, yes.
So you did consider it, and you were worried about it, yes?
Yes.
Did you ever discuss that with the BRE?
When we met with BRE, they were very clear that they couldn't discuss client confidential matters.
Was that the meeting on the 27th of November 2014, or was there a later meeting?
No, it would be the 2014 meeting.
Right, I see. Right. Well, when you learnt what you set out in this email, did you seek a conversation with BRE to tell them either that they've been misled or they got on an internal problem?
All I did with it was raise it to Diane,
Yes.
because I felt that it was sufficient to go there. We did raise the same issue with Exover later on,
Yes.
and put it to them.
And what did, to your knowledge, what did Diane Marshall do with this information?
I'm not aware that she did anything with it.
Did you know that she'd done nothing with it at the time?
I wasn't party to any emails other than, I believe, Diane replied to this email with, thank you very much.
Okay, go back a page if we can, please, Mr. Lewis. Look at page 2. You say there, towards the bottom of the screen at the beginning of the paragraph, I know that our backs are covered by BRE's assessment report. What did you mean by that?
In that we were relying that BRE were, if they were writing a report saying that it was acceptable under option 3, then, really we were going off that, and relying upon that. What could have been the case was that BRE knew data from failed tests and were applying the knowledge but not referencing it. It could be that they knew of things that we didn't. It was an in-depth assessment.
So, in a nutshell, you're saying that although you've got the piece of paper, the BRE's assessment, you know, or you have reason to believe that it's not reliable?
Not entirely, no. We were saying that, BRE are the experts in this. If they give us a report saying that it's okay, then, we weren't really in a position to argue against that or to disprove it.
Well, that's certainly, or maybe the sense of the first sentence, but the words that follow the but would belie that, wouldn't they? Your backs are covered by the BRE's assessment report, but you still have doubts. In other words, you had an underlying doubt about whether the BRE report, which put a K15 together with an aluminium rain screen panel, was reliable, for the reasons you've set out.
Yes, I did, and that was combined with, we had said to Kingspan, when we were in the meetings with Kingspan discussing what they were going to test, we did say, we feel it'd be very useful if you did a test on a lightweight metal finish so that we can get some idea of how that will perform. At which they said, along the lines of, yes, good idea, let's write that down. But no test ever came, we never saw it.
No.
And that was combined now with my, hearing this from SOTEC.
And were you flagging up to Diane Marshall and Steve Evans the fact that you could always blame the BRE for producing an unsound extrapolation for terracotta and Eternit lightweight, even though you had your own doubts about it?
No, I was just flagging up to Diane that this bit of information on lightweight, facade had come to light.
Were your, I'll be careful of my expression, were your surveyors routinely accepting option 3 reports which detailed build-ups using K15 and an aluminium rain screen?
Well, they would, there were some that were definitely being referred to me at this time.
Right.
To
and what were you
consider.
doing with them?
I was going through them, and again, it depended who wrote them, but in the case of BRE, I would have tended to, go with it. They were much more knowledgeable on this and had much more access to data than I would have had.
Even though after 6th of August 2015 you knew there was a problem that you set out here? Did you
Yes.
continue to accept?
We did. No, we didn't. Because the ones that we started to receive from Exover with a lightweight metal, we started to go back to Exover and quiz them and say, are you sure about this? And we raised our issues with them, and to the point where we went and actually sat down with them to share those concerns face to face, to say, we don't believe you can do this. And the reason for that was also tied in with the Celotex extended application report, where Exover had said there was insufficient data to conclude that Celotex with a lightweight metal finish would pass BR135.
I think we'll come to that in very shortly.
Can you just help me with this? Looking at the document on the screen and the reference to a test which was actually carried out with an aluminium panel and an assessment report which apparently, basing itself on data derived from testing an inorganic material, demonstrated that an aluminium panel would be acceptable. Did that inconsistency not suggest that the whole process of doing assessments was flawed, or might be flawed?
It didn't strike me as such. I mean, at this time, we also knew that you could follow option 1, build a system from materials of limited combustibility, and if you built them in a certain arrangement, they would still fail an 8414 test.
Well, that's because you're testing a specific construction, aren't you? With specific dimensions and materials. But I mean, I'd have thought this was a rather worrying piece of evidence that a system actually being tested with aluminium failed, and someone comes along and says, well, I can show you that aluminium is satisfactory by reference to an extrapolation from some test on some completely different material.
That was the situation we were in, yes.
Well, did it not prompt you or someone else to ask the question whether option 3 was actually a safe option?
It didn't lead us to question the whole option 3 thing, but it did lead us to question this particular build-up. But in terms of the robustness of the option 3 system, we didn't, we didn't we didn't change that. That continued. We didn't suddenly lose total faith in it or anything. We still considered it to be a method of showing compliance that, that was allowed.
Did you not think it deserved further investigation?
No, it didn't.
Do you think you should have done?
Yes, very likely, yes.
And why didn't you?
Because at the time, this was the policy that had been adopted by NHBC on these jobs, and my time was very much taken up in looking at these reports and, dealing with them along that policy.
Now, you refer at the end of this... Mr. Chairman, I'm so sorry.
No, I'd asked my question. Thank you.
I don't know whether you can go back to page 3, please, where you said, happy to elaborate more on Tuesday. Did you have a meeting with them on whether it was the Tuesday or another day, but shortly after you sent this email?
I can't remember what was happening on that Tuesday. I can't remember what it was.
Now, you've referred to a meeting with Exova. Let's look at that. I think it's right in general, isn't it, that although the reports from Exova that you got under the initial iteration of option 3 were comprehensive, you had concerns about them?
We did with regards to the lightweight metal finish.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Let's look at let's look at EXO 402137, please. And if we go in this email run to page 3, we will find an email from you to Janet Murrell of the 9th of December 2015, also sent to a Jenny Lucas Cox, copied to Steve Evans and Dave White, yes?
Yes.
And the subject is lightweight metal cladding finishes, BS8414, BR135. And you say, Dear Janet, I write following my conversation with Jenny earlier this week. NHBC is currently receiving a number of desktop studies of BS8414/BR135 external fire spread performance of facade construction from Exova, which conclude with the opinion that the use of aluminium and zinc finishes in conjunction with combustible insulation is acceptable, while some of these have also been acceptable to us following our own assessment of the geometry of the building and how it fits within the requirements of Regulation B41. Several have been rejected because NHBC remains unconvinced that accurate conclusions can be drawn from data from tests using thicker, heavier, inorganic materials when assembled in a manner currently undertaken by the cladding industry. NHBC feels that this issue needs more discussion and so would welcome the opportunity to meet with you, either at our Milton Keynes office or at your Warrington office. In addition to me, attendants from NHBC include Steve Evans, Dave White. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Now, did the sense of that main paragraph there reflect your concern about extrapolation that had been done by the BRE in the last part of the 6th of August email we looked at a little bit earlier?
Yes, it included, studies that we were seeing on this type of build-up.
Yes, and the person at the NHBC that remained unconvinced was you, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Did Steve Evans and Dave White share your lack of conviction?
No, they were relying on me to share what I felt, and They were supportive of that, yes.
They didn't disagree with you, did they?
No, they didn't.
No. Now let's look at page 2, please. Scroll up. It looks from the email run that you got no response from Exover to that message, so you wrote again on the 23rd of December. Hello, Janet. I've just reviewed another Exover report which justified the use of lightweight metal cladding finishes in conjunction with combustible insulation. At this stage, NHBC doesn't feel comfortable in accepting it for the reasons already raised with you. As such, can I repeat my request to meet with Exover and discuss this matter at some point early in the new year, either at our offices or yours? You then, I think, get a response to that. My question is whether, between the two emails you send Janet Murrell, did you have a discussion with Exover, or did they simply not respond at all?
I don't recall a response, so probably there wasn't one, and I don't recall a telephone conversation either.
Now, if we go up the chain, we can see, if we go to page 1, we can see that Jennifer Lucas Cox, who is at Exover and has signed herself off as a certification engineer based in Warrington, writes to you on the 6th of January 2016. Do you see the foot of page 1?
Yes.
And she writes to you and Janet Murrell, copy to Steve Evans, Dave White and Jackie Alder. And she says, "Hi John, for our information, could you confirm the reference number of the Exover report you're referring to so that we could look at this also?" Page 2. I know you suggested we meet to discuss a similar matter, but as discussed, Janet and I didn't feel it necessary at the time. You are more than welcome to come here and we can discuss the matter further, along with anything else you feel necessary. It seems there are a few circumstances which require clarification, perhaps. We have a number of dates available for you if you wish to visit us, and then she sets them out, and the rest is about booking. Just looking at that, when she says, as discussed, at the very top of the screen there, in that first line there on page 2, what's she referring to? What discussion?
We must have had a telephone conversation.
Do you remember when it was, whether before or after your second email?
I don't recall it. I mean, it must have been after the first email. I don't recall.
Do you remember the discussion, or a discussion with Exover, in which they told you that they didn't see the need to discuss their desktop reports with you?
I can't recall it. I can recall the meeting, but I'm struggling to recall a discussion, telephone conversation.
So you can't remember whether they gave you a reason for why they weren't prepared to discuss it or felt it unnecessary?
Not in advance of the meeting, no.
Right. Now, as we can see, I've shown you, Jennifer Lucas Cox gives you some dates, but if you go to the top of the email chain, page 1, we can see your response to her. You say, "Hello, Jenny," and this is the same day, 6th of January 2016. "Thanks for the email. The most recent schemes are as below. They give an example of the range of different applications we're seeing, and there are 4 of them. Greenwich Wharf, K15 in conjunction with Aluminium Honeycomb, Scarborough Road, K15 with zinc, Grange Walk, this is number 3, Celotex RS5000 with Aluminium, and then the 4th one is appraisal of Celotex PIR facade cladding systems, which is data from the Celotex test extrapolated to other kinds of external finish." And it goes on, "With regards to aluminium finishes, it concluded that there wasn't sufficient evidence to judge with certainty that compliance with BR 135 could be achieved." You see that?
Yes.
You refer in that to those 4. Were there any others?
They were at the time, they would be the only 4 that Exover had written.
Right. And the one that Exover had come back and said no to, effectively, was number 4, yes? In other words, they couldn't extrapolate?
Yes,
Right,
that was the
report.
Celotex, the generic Celotex one,
Right.
yes.
Was that the only one where they'd come back and said there wasn't sufficient evidence? Or were there others?
Yes, and this is what led us to query the other 3.
Yeah. Now, let's go to EXO 402138. This is an email from you of the 3rd of February 2016 to Jennifer Lucas Cox and also Janet Murrell and a gentleman called Franz Papp, who may be familiar to the panel from earlier evidence. Copy to Steve Evans, Dave White and Malika Katkoria, who I think was joined by this time. And it's sent on the 3rd of February, subject meeting to discuss performance of metal cladding systems used with combustible insulation. Now, it's quite a long email, so let's just take it in stages. Thanks for the email. There are a number of items we'd like to discuss with you, all related to the justifications which Exova have provided in support of Regulation B41, BR135, and BS8414. 1. Aluminium composite materials. Aluminium and zinc sheet. The BS8414 tests which we've seen are all based on heavier inorganic materials or timber products, yet the data from these is being extrapolated to thin, lightweight metal finishes. It's unclear to us how far the knowledge can be stretched before it becomes unreliable. We have hearsay evidence that tests using lightweight metal finishes with combustible insulations have been tested but were unsuccessful. Now, pausing there, what hearsay evidence are you referring to there?
That was the SOTEC.
That's SOTEC, is it?
Yes.
Going on with point 2, you say, aluminium composite materials. As above, there seems to be no test data available for the wide range of ACM products. In some of the Exova reports, it's been unclear which product has been referenced. It's known that the material core properties have a large impact on the combustibility of these products. I'm pausing again. What core properties are you referring to there? What material core properties are you talking about?
That particular one, we were referring to, the more commonly seen ACM materials where the core can range from 100% polythene to a mix of polyethylene and mineral or a mineral content.
You just said 100% polythene. What did you mean?
The core of the many of the ACM panels was when I say polythene, it's
you did.
It's a synonym for polyethylene. It's
is it?
the same thing. Yes.
Right. Well, that may simplify things later. But so you use the word polythene because you think that it's the same thing as polyethylene.
Yes. The reason I use polythene is going back unrelated to this, but polythene was a commonly known term within the construction industry when you came talking about damp-proof membranes and things like that.
Right. But to cut to the point I think you've given us already, when you refer to core properties, you are including ACM with a 100% polyethylene core, a PE core.
Yes, we were, yes.
Yes. Now, had any of the desktop reports from Exova thus far covered ACM PE?
No, the Exova were clear that a 100% polyethylene cored ACM would not pass. We never saw any test reports, any justifications for those.
From Exova?
From Exova, no, or indeed generally from anybody apart from the one scheme we've mentioned about the Apex building.
Right. Now, then let's go on in your email at point 3. Aluminium honeycomb panels. Many of these contain significant amounts of resin to bond the external finish to the honeycomb backing. The Exova reports reference only the metal components of these panels with no consideration of the properties of the resin, nor how these materials are likely to actually perform in a fire situation. And then glazed spandrel panels, you express your view there. Brick slip cladding, and again you say in the last sentence there, again we query how far the knowledge can be stretched without a need to test a sample of the assembled components. And then 6, Celotex RS5000. Unlike other combustible insulation manufacturers, RS5000 has been tested only in one build-up. Celotex provided us with a copy of Exova's generic appraisal of other facade cladding systems, which stated that with regards to an aluminium finish, the test evidence wasn't sufficient to judge with certainty that compliance with BR135 could be achieved. Yet, we have subsequently been provided with site-specific reports where RS5000 has been deemed acceptable in conjunction with aluminium sheet, ACM, and corium brick slips. Now, do you know which those site reports are?
Not offhand, no. I can't recall which ones specifically, which jobs they were.
Right. To be clear, just looking at the date, Grenfell had not been signed off until the July of 2016, so they couldn't include that site. And that's not an NHBC site
No,
anyway.
we had nothing to do with Grenfell.
No. And then 7, cladding build-ups generally. The Exova reports deal with the expected performance of the component materials. without consideration of how a completed system is likely to perform. In addition, the aluminium support components of many systems vary in thickness between manufacturers, with no analysis of the effects of, quotes, value engineering, quotes, the thicknesses down to the minimum acceptable from a structural point of view, thickness. Now, you can see what you said there. This email was copied to Steve Evans and Dave White, as I've shown you. Had you raised these concerns with them or other senior staff at Nhbc before sending this message to Exova?
Yes, because item 7 looked very much like Dave's words.
Right. So this was to some extent at least a collaborative exercise?
Oh yes, very much so.
Right. Now the list appears to go against what you say in your witness statement that we saw earlier about Exova's reports being comprehensive and assuring. Just to remind you, that was paragraph 182B at page 47. That's right, isn't it?
Well, generally, we did have confidence in Exova. It was just with regards to this lightweight panel one, because we saw the disconnect between what Exova had said when they assessed the Celotex build-up compared to what they were saying in some of the job-specific ones thereafter. And it was that disconnect that we were wanting to bottom out, really. That was the thrust of the meeting, mainly.
Right. It's right to think, isn't it, that Exova had in fact provided an option 3 report approving the use of RS 5000 with ACM.
Reading this, it looks like they had done, yes.
Yes, and indeed, I think the reference to that, just for the record, is CEL 403717. There's no need to go to it. But what was their explanation of providing such a report in circumstances where, as you say in 6, the test evidence wasn't sufficient to judge with certainty that compliance with BR 135 could be achieved?
Well, I understand that the thinking from Exova was in some of in the fire test that had been carried out, the flame hit the external cladding panel, which then broke up and fell away and opened up the cavity and the insulation to the fire. And they were benchmarking that against what was likely to happen when another material was used in its place. Would that new material open up in the same way to the same extent, faster or slower than what had happened in the case of the tested arrangement?
Does that not indicate to you that, at least so far as Exova's approach was concerned, option 3 was unreliable, at least in relation to particular build-ups? Combustible insulation with a lightweight metal cladding.
We didn't have the skills or the knowledge to say that with any certainty. All we could do was go and quiz them and say, please elaborate why you say this. You're the experts, we're not.
Well, indeed, but the questions you're asking are, with great respect, pretty pointed, aren't they?
Yes.
There's nothing inexpert about the questions, is there?
I would hope not, no.
No. And to say you were in a position to be able to bring some expert scrutiny to bear on what Exova was doing, and on this one at least, they'd come up short, hadn't they?
We had concerns, yes.
Yes. Now, there's a meeting. Sorry, to finish the point off. You had concerns, but did the fact that you had concerns not indicate to you that the whole edifice of option 3 was built on shaky foundations? Because even Exova, as people you expected to have the requisite level of expertise, could not always produce a reliable option 3 report.
We didn't take that view at the time. We possibly wouldn't have written off the whole option 3 process on the basis of, this one type of cladding system.
Did you not seek to give it some further thought, that there may be some cladding systems in common application which really ought to fall outside option 3 altogether?
We didn't know, because BRE and others were also backing up this type of testing.
Despite the fact that we saw from your 6th of August email you had very considerable reservations about it.
Yes, but we didn't write off the option 3 testing process.
No, I know.
We continued. We still had reasonable confidence that, that at least the intended way it was meant to be done should be reliable.
Now, the meeting with Exova eventually took place on the 4th of February 2016. And we get this from Janet Murrell's statement. It was attended by Janet Murrell, Jennifer Lucas-Cox and Franz Papp. And you were there as well. Do you recall that?
Yes, I remember it, yes.
Yes. Now, Janet Murrell and Franz Papp were fire engineers, qualified fire engineers, weren't they?
No.
No?
I don't believe they were fire engineers. I believe
Right.
Janet has a PhD in chemistry.
Okay.
And as for Franz, I don't know what his were.
Why were you meeting people who were not fire engineers then, in order
Because-
to discuss this problem?
Because Exova was a UCAS accredited laboratory.
Right. I see. Right, I see. So, just to round this point off, you might actually end up by having to deal with people doing option 3 reports who are in fact less expert than you, purely because Appendix A pushed you in their direction.
Well, not in the case of Exova. These people were very much more knowledgeable than I was.
Or, as you might put it, the approved document supporting Regulation 7.
Sorry, I'm confused.
Yes, well, my point is that you gave us 2 camps earlier. You said you didn't have to be fire engineers. They could be UCAS accredited, people from UCAS accredited laboratories.
Yes.
Did the fact that you were meeting Janet Murrell and Franz Papp, who are, as you thought, not fire engineers, as you've told us, not give you some concerns that the edifice of option 3 and the people qualified to do option 3 reports might be a little bit shaky?
No, it didn't, because, Exova were a very well-known testing body that could, interpolate on these issues, these matters.
Well, now, Jennifer Lucas-Cox was a certification engineer, according to her email signature that I showed you. Did she also have fire engineering credentials?
I don't know what Jenny had.
Right. Now, Steve Evans and Dave White were there as well, I think.
Yes.
If we look at Janet Murrell's statement, we see what she says about this meeting. This is at EXO 402132, please. Page 31. I'll just show you page 1, just so that you're clear of what it is we're looking at.
Sorry, can I clarify? Definitely Dave was there.
Right,
I'm not actually now 100% sure that Steve was there.
right. Well, we have an email, which I think shows that he was, but you can't remember. I don't think that matters particularly for present purposes.
Okay.
Looking at page 1, this is Janet Murrell's statement to the inquiry of October last year. And if we go to page 31, paragraph 7.36G, please, you can see what she says. She says, my general recollection, though, is that we discussed the matters listed in Mr. Lewis's 3rd of February 2016 email in some detail. That's the email we've just been looking at together. My sense was that since NHBC were not fire engineers themselves, their purpose in meeting with us, was to understand in more detail the conclusions we had reached in our reports in relation to the relevant products from a fire engineering perspective. Our aim in speaking with them was to talk through the issues that they had raised so as to allay their concerns. And then she says, as a result of our meeting, I believe Mr. Lewis had a greater understanding of our views of the uses of the various facade types and materials, and his concerns in that regard had largely been resolved. Do you agree that with Janet Murrell's recollection or characterisation of the meeting in G?
Yeah, that generally ties in with my recollection, yes.
Yes. Yes, and she seems to recall that the purpose of the meeting was to get a fire engineering perspective. If Janet Murrell and Franz Papp were not fire engineers, how would that happen?
Well, they would use their other expertise in knowing how these things were done. I mean, Janet did have a good background, I understand, in fire, having I believe she was at the fire research station and things like this. She knew her stuff when it came to fire things as far as we were concerned. So, I mean, I don't know for sure what her qualifications in fire engineering were. All I know is what I've read in her statement about her having the degree in chemistry.
Yes, paragraph 2.9. I'm not sure I can illuminate you any further. Right. And did it concern you at all that you'd come along to the meeting for a fire engineering perspective and were getting it from people who were not actually fire engineers? They were just people who, as you put it, knew their stuff when it came to fire things.
Well, ex-over Warrington Fire were generally regarded in the construction industry as, if there was a pecking order, it would probably start with BRE, and they would be a close second.
Right.
That if you needed advice on something fire-related, they were a good company to go to.
Yes. So this is really about brand management, isn't it? In fact, isn't it? So you have X-over and can use the X-over name rather than the actual particular qualifications of the actual particular people producing the actual reports.
My understanding was that they were very well-qualified people.
Now, after this meeting, did you remain concerned that knowledge was being stretched too far in X-over's Option 3 reports?
We wrote... No, I mean, I would tend to agree with what Janet Morell wrote there, that, we'd gone with them with a list of concerns, we'd put it to them being the experts in all of this lot, they'd given their reasons why, they felt it was acceptable. They said, perhaps it's just really, we're not giving you enough detail in the reports, and we will give you more detail in future just to back up what we're saying, just to give you more information to back up our opinion. And that's what, the kind of the outcome of the meeting was.
Right. Did X-over actually explain to you how they were able to extrapolate data from tests on heavier inorganic materials and apply it to a build-up using aluminium or zinc, as you had asked them?
It was, as I said earlier, they compared it to, the fact that, like the terracotta tiles, they as soon as the heat touches them, they tend to shatter and fall away completely. It was all down to the rate at which the external panel would be breached before the fire started to then attack the insulation material.
Did they explain to you how they were able to approve ACM panels to be used on buildings over 18 metres when there was no large-scale testing that had been completed using those panels as one of the components?
Yes, they were of, the same sort of, techniques, using the same techniques, looking at how long it would be before the panel disintegrated and the fire touched the insulation.
Did you really understand? Let me try to do this in a slightly different way. When you heard their explanation, what did you learn that you didn't know before?
I hadn't really thought about it before. This was kind of new stuff, new territory for me. When they elaborated on what they, their thought process was in looking and writing these things, then it made sense, with my knowledge of what I'd learnt in, fire engineering, it didn't seem off the wall. It kind of made sense.
How, if you didn't have test data using ACM panels in a build-up, how could you extrapolate from something as different from an inorganic material to an ACM which had never been tested?
As I say, it was purely down to the rate, the time period between the fire touching the external panel and it being breached. It wasn't totally based on just the terracotta test. Don't forget, at this point we'd also seen the Trespa test, and so there was that, there was useful information in that test as well.
But if you didn't have, I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis, what I'm struggling to understand is that if there was no test data of ACM as a component in any build-up at all, how would X-over know, and how did you understand they would know how it would perform?
They would have, X-over had knowledge of, well, I assume they had knowledge of how the panels reacted under fire. They would have knowledge of the heat release rate of those panels when they caught fire. They would have knowledge of the failure mechanism of those panels when heater was applied to them. That was as I understood, the mixing pot of things that they considered.
Well, how closely did you scrutinise this? I mean, did you ask them this question? Well, wait a minute, Exover. You only got small-scale test results for an ACM panel, a 476 Part 6 and 7 test, or perhaps a combustibility test. That's all you've got. It's not the same thing as an 8414 test. So how can you extrapolate? You have no data. Did you ask them that question?
We didn't ask it specifically. We relied on them to have considered that data as part of their response when they were writing these reports.
Did they tell you that their report had found that Celotex and aluminium metal sheets would not have met BR135 with sufficient certainty, which is the very fact you yourself had picked up at point 6 in your 3rd of February email?
Yes, that was well documented by that point.
And if that's the case, how were they able to approve ACM then? Or how do they explain to you that they were able to approve ACM by a process of extrapolation?
From the point of the Celotex, generic Celotex test extrapolation using the aluminium panel, I recall it was something along the lines of, we didn't have quite enough evidence, but we felt it probably would be okay, but we didn't want to commit on that. But on the job-specific schemes, they felt able, in many cases, to describe, as I said, the rate at which the aluminium would melt and the panel open up. And then from there, they then went to, and if it was an ACM panel, how long would it take for the ACM panel to melt or disintegrate before the fire then got onto the insulation?
So let me just understand this. You raised the concern that you set out at point 6 because, as you record there, the report had found that the Celotex and aluminium metal sheets together would not have met BR135 with sufficient certainty. Did Janet Murrell or anybody else at Exover satisfy you that, in fact, it would?
They satisfied us that in the job-specific scenarios that we'd asked them, they were, they wrote, their reports were writing and saying, with that one, yes, it probably would. There could have been differences between, there were differences between the Celotex build-up and what we were looking at in many of these others. I mean, not least that they were K15 rather than Celotex. The thickness of the aluminium panel would have made a difference as well, and very likely, the way that panel was fixed and other things. Their view was, they took all that into account and produced a report, job-specific report, based on it.
Now, I want to ask you about the 2015 review. If we go back to your statement, please, at page 32, you say this at paragraph 115. Following the change in position described at paragraph 91 above, you see that?
Yes.
Nhbc conducted a process to review projects with a story higher than 18 metres. This was known as the Combustible Cladding Review or the 2015 Project Review. Now, just pausing there, the change in position from paragraph 91 is, I think, a reference to the fact that as of January, the Nhbc was asking builders to show compliance with BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And if we continue to paragraph 116, you say, a report was produced from NHBC's record setting out the buildings still in build that were likely to have a story over 18 metres in height, on which the combustible materials control list would be based. Due to the way our systems work, we could not filter by materials used and were only checking projects that were still under construction. Now, pausing again, is it right that the 2015 review only looked at buildings currently in construction and did not include any buildings which had already been completed, regardless of whether they had combustible components in the external walls or not?
Yes, the purpose of that review was to look at the buildings which were still in build, that we could still do something with.
Who decided not to look at buildings which had already been completed?
It would be Steve and Diane.
And why was that? Did you ever know what the reason was for that decision?
Yes, because those buildings had been signed off. There was
Oh.
nothing really a building control body could do with a job that had already been completed.
Well, if you had, let it be assumed, discovered that those that had been signed off on an erroneous basis, for example, because the surveyor had thought wrongly that K15 was a material of limited combustibility, why was there nothing that NHBC could do about it?
Well, many of them would have not even been NHBC's building control.
No, but those that were.
The ones that had, sorry, specifically the question again, please.
Yes, absolutely. Let it be supposed that you had discovered at this time that there was a legacy of buildings approved for building control purposes by NHBC's surveyors as approved inspectors or as an approved inspector, which had passed as compliant a building over 18 metres which had used Kingspan K15 being a material of limited, not being a material of limited combustibility in the external wall build-up. Why was there nothing that NHBC could do about it?
Well, there was nothing we could do because, once, as I say, building control legislation is such that once a building control body signs off a job, that is the end of, any involvement they can have in that job. Building control cannot go back to a building that it signed off a year ago and say, oh, by the way, I think you need to change this, and we want you to change that. That was not the route to go down.
No.
And it was not that NHBC was just saying, we're not bothered. They seriously were bothered that, but the first initial tranche of jobs which we could target very effectively and quickly were the ones where we hadn't issued the final certificate, and NHBC was very much still able to have some control over those, and that was the first focus of those jobs first.
Yes. I'm interested in the history and the thinking about the history. Are you able to explain why it was that NHBC did not do anything about the fact that, as had been discovered, there was a legacy of high-rise buildings which had been signed off as compliant by NHBC inspectors, which were in fact not compliant? Or were at risk of not being compliant?
Yes, we knew that was the case. I believe that all that was conveyed to the NHBC board for them to, be aware of.
Yeah. Now that is what Steve Evans told the inquiry. He said that there were discussions with the NHBC board. That was date 221, page 26, at line 11. Was that right? Did you remember the fact of a discussion with NHBC's board on that very question?
I didn't attend board meetings.
No, but did somebody tell you that it had happened, that this point had been escalated to the board for them to consider what to do about?
Well, I knew that regular updates were going to the NHBC board, and as far as I knew, that did include, the fact of these are how many schemes we've got on the go, and very likely there are others that have been completed.
Do you know whether there was any consideration at any time within NHBC about undertaking a risk assessment in relation to the legacy of high-rise buildings featuring combustible insulation, which had been completed before the 1st of January 2014?
I believe there were discussions happening at higher level. There were not discussions I was really party to, but I knew NHBC was not wanting to just wash its hands of all those schemes. And it still had the build mark warranty was there for schemes where we had carried out building control. There was claims that could be made.
Yeah. So, if not wanting to wash its hands of those schemes, what was NHBC, to your knowledge, considering by way of addressing the problem?
I had no knowledge of what they were really doing. I wasn't involved in those discussions. I knew that it was an issue that they were having to do something with and think about.
You say it was discussed at a higher level. Who discussed it? We know Steve Evans says that it was taken to the board, but what about Diane Marshall? Was she involved in that decision, to your knowledge?
Yeah, she was. I mean, Diane was aware of it. I believe Ian Davis was aware of it as well.
Yeah. Now, going on to paragraph 117, still on the screen, you say a team is established to review all the projects within the above scope. I led the team, which also included David Alexander White, who I think is Dave White, isn't it?
Yes, he got married by that point.
Right, and he adopted his partner's name, did he?
Indeed.
In part, right. Gary Jarvis and Phil Pettinger. We reviewed each of the buildings and categorised them as high, medium or low risk. If there was a low likelihood of fire safety issues, such as a brickwork construction, then they were categorised as low risk. Higher risk materials, such as ACM, 100% PE cord and FR grades using a mix of PE and mineral content, or Trespa, a timber laminate, were categorised as higher risk. Now, just pausing there, did any of the team other than you have any kind of fire engineering qualifications?
Dave, they didn't have fire engineering qualifications, but they were selected because they had an awful lot of knowledge of, this and other building-related, matters.
So
especially Dave. Dave had a huge amount of knowledge of cladding systems, as did Phil, and as did Gary as well.
Who made the decision on which category a particular building would fall into?
I believe I put forward some suggested categories to Steve, who accepted them.
And how did you go about formulating your categories and deciding which buildings should fit into which category?
I based it on my own knowledge of what materials, were considered to be a higher risk and lower risk, such as we knew that brickwork was probably a lower risk, and actually the end of the scale would have been 100% PE cord ACM.
Did you have set parameters, objective criteria with which to work, or comparative test data that you were using, or was this just
It was.
feel?
I mean, this process was more of a screening exercise to go through the jobs and just give them a ranking based upon what I considered to be, as I say, high risk, medium risk, or low risk.
Now, we've seen that you refer there to PE core, yes, ACM 100% PE core,
Yes.
or a mixture.
Yes.
Why would your customers still have buildings under construction using a 100% PE cord ACM panel if NHBC was not accepting those products as a matter of course?
There were still some that were slipping through that were getting it, but not in most cases on a large scale. The areas of PE cord ACM were tending to just be, small isolated areas used as part of another cladding system or something of that manner.
So can we just be careful then with this paragraph? When you say higher risk materials, such as ACM 100% PE cord, were categorised as higher risk, that doesn't tell us that there was a complete ban on them so far as NHBC was concerned above 18 metres. What was the position? Was the position that you were accepting them for buildings under 18 metres?
Well, for the purpose of this exercise, we were really going through the architect's proposals, and if we found that the architect was proposing 100% PE cord, then that, for the purpose of the exercise, was getting flagged as a high risk. After that, then the process of investigation as to had that been changed, was that still proposed, had it been built that way, and all those questions, they followed on later on. This was really just a screening through of what the architect had proposed to put on the building. Bearing in mind that in many cases there was a very big difference between what the architects proposed and what finally got built.
I'm just interested to know why there were 100% PE cord aluminium composite material was higher risk as opposed simply to not accepted at all.
It was a screening exercise,
Did the NHBC have established practices in relation to PE ACM?
They weren't formally written down, but all of the SRPM surveyors and by this point the other building surveyors were, they'd all been told several times about the risk of 100% PE cord ACM.
What percentage of mineral as against PE content was was acceptable?
Well, for the purposes of this screening
For
exercise,
this screening exercise.
I think anything that had, if the architect's details said ACM, we immediately put that into the high risk. We would work through the detail later on and see if it could be lowered, but for the purpose of this, it was kept up high.
And as a general matter, post-screening and post-analysis, what ACM products in particular were you accepting typically in 2015?
The range of ones we saw, we saw, the brand names I can think of are Alucobond, Alpolic.
Mm-hmm. They were A1 or A2, weren't they?
Well, they came in a mix. They came in a range generally. There were one product could have three versions: the 100% PE cord, the FR version, which was a mix of PE and mineral, and the A1, A2 rated, which was mineral content.
Continuing with paragraph 119 of your statement, you say, Diane Marshall, Steve Evans, Ian Davis and I subsequently held meetings to review the specifics of each high or medium risk project in detail, starting with the higher risk ones. The results of the review are documented in the combustible materials control list that we all populated as part of the review. By way of context, all of these buildings had a condition placed on them preventing them being finalised for the purposes of building control and or warranty cover. As a result, the process we were conducting held up the completion of some of those projects. That said, once we identified a project had a low risk rating, then that project was recommended to continue. Were any of these buildings ever unable to be finalised for building control or warranty cover?
No, but a lot of them did require remedial works to be carried out on site before we could do that.
And in what ways were buildings which had a condition preventing them being finalised able to get that condition removed?
When they'd either provided a sufficiently robust justification for what the material combination they were using, or they'd gone back and in some way remediated the building to an extent that was appropriate for us to then consider it to be safe.
And who made that decision?
Ultimately, it would be, the final sign-off from Diane or Steve. Sorry, Diane or Ian. The process to get to there would have been, via myself, usually with Diane and Steve. Usually there was a meeting with the builders. Very often there'd be a meeting between the builders, us and Exover, to discuss what was considered to be appropriate. And then, it would continue from that point.
Mr. Chairman, I've got about 5 more minutes on this line. Would it be convenient?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's look at the table, which is your exhibit JAL 225, which is the same as Steve Evans's. It's at NHB 403038. Now, we need the native version of this because it's an Excel spreadsheet. Thank you. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you can see that there are 3 tabs: pre-31st December 13, post-1st January 14, and escalations. Yes?
Yes.
And let's, if we scroll down in this tab, you can see, perhaps you don't need to, but take it from me, there were 196 projects. Yes?
Yes.
And the second tab is those reviewed after 1st of January 2014. And if you look at that, if we just click on it, there were 95 projects. That's the total number in the left-hand-most column. And I think in each case, that was the project, which could be made up of a number of buildings. Yes?
Yes.
And the third tab is escalations. And if we click on that and scroll to the bottom, you can see that that includes 145 buildings.
No.
Well, projects, rather.
No.
No?
No. The escalations tab was my log of the referral or the response we were getting back from the builder after we applied a condition. So on any scheme, the builder would reply to that condition, and this was a log of everything that had come to me either via an email or via a general referral on the internal fusion system.
Right. So this is your log of those which had been escalated?
This was a log of what I did with every time, I got a referral from one of the surveyors.
What was the criteria, what were the criteria for escalating a project to Steve Evans?
This was not a log of the ones that went to Steve. This was a log of jobs that came to me for me to look at.
But I thought all of them came to you in the first instance, didn't they?
Yes, everything on here came to me.
Yes.
But these were, the only ones that then got escalated up to Steve that were in a condition to get escalated were typically, the way you see the date in column I. It won't be completely there, but,
But the third tab is, forgive me, it may be my fault, but I'd thought that these were all those which had been escalated purely by the fact that you'd called the tab escalations.
No, this was a list of ones, any job that came across my desk and the response that I gave to it. Hence why you're seeing things like, you can see there line 146, column H, no proper assessment received. I got it on the 26th of January, looked at it, there was nothing there that we could really do anything with, returned it back to the surveyor.
Right.
That one didn't go anywhere.
So although it's called escalations, this tab isn't actually escalations at all?
No.
Right. Well, let's go back to the first tab and scroll down then, and we can see a number of red-coloured high-risk buildings. You can see that just from the first page of the spreadsheet, yes?
Yes.
And they have a description of the elements of the external facade in many, in fact most, but they don't contain details of the exact materials, do they?
No.
Why is that?
It was a screening exercise. It wasn't a full in-depth review at this stage.
But was that information held somewhere in NHBC's system?
Yeah. It was all on the jobs, but literally thousands of documents on every single one of these jobs.
Right. Do you know of the projects that feature in this spreadsheet, how many roughly were prevented from receiving final sign-off by you or by Steve Evans?
Well, ultimately, it might help if I just can explain, say, line 121.
Yes.
The initial review, when myself and Phil and Gary and Dave were sitting in the room, one of us looked at that job and found that the architect was proposing, an ACM by the look of it. Well, there was an issue on there that we considered this was a high risk. That stayed in column AG. Then later on, myself, Diane, Steve sat around in a room, and then we went into each job to look more closely at the details and the arrangement of the building, and we obviously came to the conclusion that actually that one can be downgraded, and so that one went down to a low risk, and that was it. Thereafter the jobs would have been returned to the surveyor to do something with in the normal way.
I see. So we can actually do the maths ourselves, can we, by comparing AG and AI?
Yes.
Those two columns, and seeing which remained red and which went to
Yes.
went to yellow.
Yes. Initially, if we had concerns, it went as a high. Later on, we'd see if we could downgrade it.
And do you know, from recollection, and without digging through this document, how many of these projects had PE called ACM on them? Was it, just from recollection, a significant number?
No, it wasn't. There were quite a few that had an FR rated core. In terms of ones with 100% PE core, I don't recall really there were very many at this stage.
Right. And what about combustible insulation? You can see quite a lot of K15 on.
Yeah. Most of them had combustible insulation.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Does that suit you?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Right, well, I think it's time we had a break, Mr. Lewis, so we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 4. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when we're out of the room. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. 25 to 4 then, please. Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Okay. All right, Mr. Lewis, ready?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like now to ask you about 12.7. We went through the meaning of 12.7 of ADB and your evidence about it when we looked at Tony Baker's email from the BRE to you in May 2013, yesterday, and again at the meeting that you had with Sarah Colwell on the 27th of November 2014. I want to ask you about an email Steve Evans wrote to Brian Martin, who was at DCLG in 2015. It's at NHB 402792. And if we go in that, please, to page 4, right at the foot of the page, page 4, foot of the page, we can see Steve Evans' email of the 15th of June to Brian Martin, combustible cladding, and it's one of those where the heading is separated from the text. Over to page 5, please. It says this, and it's a long email. It starts, "Good afternoon, Brian. I write to request the department's view." Are you familiar with this email?
Yes, I drafted that email.
You drafted it. And what prompted you to draft it?
Steve asked me to draft it.
And what prompted him, do you know?
I don't know what prompted, but I think it was that we wanted once again to be certain that our interpretation of paragraph 12.7 included the external cladding panels finish system.
Right. Now, the date of this is 15th of June 2015. Do you know whether this email was written after the issue 1 of the BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 in 2015, in other words, the revised version, or before?
Can we look at the dates again? What was the date?
Yes, if you scroll up to page 4 at the very foot of the page, it's the 15th of June 2015.
When did we issue the...
Well, I don't know precisely. I'm asking you. Do you know precisely when issue 1 was published?
I can't recall if it was... No, I can't recall the timeline.
Was this email written before or after you conducted the 2015 combustible cladding review? Do you know?
No, this was written before it.
Right. Now let's look at the email. It's long, but it's important, so we need to go through it. Good afternoon, Brian. I write to request the department's view regarding the need for limited combustibility external cladding finishes on buildings with a floor level exceeding 18 metres in height, assessed in accordance with paragraph 12.7 of approved document B2, together with the associated paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9. As I understand it, section 12, para 12.2, explains that there is a need to slow down the rate of fire spread across the external faces of the building. This is elaborated upon in paragraph 12.5, which states that the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it is likely to be a risk to health and safety, and the use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present a risk in tall buildings. Generally, a tall block of flats with a defend-in-place policy would be considered a high risk to health and safety. At this point, therefore, it is assumed that the entire wall build-up is at issue, and so the following parts of the external wall construction should not assist with fire spread. And the first 2 bullet points cover external cladding material and backing board, and the third, insulation. And then going further down, however, the wording of para 12.7 of ADB2 then goes on to state that in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. See Appendix A. This restriction does not apply to masonry cavity wall construction that complies with diagram 34 in section 9. Whilst this paragraph is clear that insulation products are a risk to fire spread, firstly, it's unclear as to the meaning of filler products, and secondly, it is unclear whether it is intended that these recommendations apply to the external cladding finishes. The use of the word etc. implies that the major components of the cladding system need to be considered. Whilst many cladding finishes fall within Table A7 guidance for, quotes, materials of limited combustibility, unquotes, we have come across a large number which do not. And so, even with a Class 0 surface spread of flame rating, and when used with a MOLC insulation, the objectives of Section 12 may still not be met, even though the guidance in paragraph 12.5 has been met. Guidance in BS 9991 is more clear, stating that combustible materials should not be used in cladding systems and extensive cavities, see below. However, it also doesn't subsequently state that the cladding finishes should be mulch when used on tall buildings. And if we go to page 6, BRE document 135, fire performance of external thermal insulations for walls of multi-storey buildings. The alternative approach to complying with the above clauses is clear that the external cladding finish and its interaction with the insulation is an important factor in the resistance to fire spread across external walls. We have met with Dr. Sarah Colwell of BRE, and she verbally confirmed that the issue of fire spread by way of the external finish is as important as fire spread via the insulation. Our own view is that there is little point in ensuring that an insulation product meets with mulch requirements when it can then be faced with a cladding finish which, whilst achieving a Class 0 surface spread of flame requirement, becomes a contributory factor in the spread of fire up the building when acted upon by a flame plume from a flash day of a fire. However, there appears to be a difference in interpretation across the industry, and so your opinion, steer, would be very welcome. Thank you for your time. Now, this is, as I say, 15th of June 2015, and we touched on this topic before. My first question is this. Were you aware of anybody at NHBC discussing this question with Brian Martin at any point before this?
No.
Had you come across colleagues or others in industry who also thought that the wording of 12.7 and the reference to filler or filler material was unclear?
We had come across people that interpreted that this only applied to the insulation and not the external finish. Not many people were pointing out the word filler and saying, what does that word mean?
I see.
You know.
So was that right? There was a divided society, as it were. Some people who thought that 12.7, the use of word filler meant that 12.7 applied to the whole of the facade build-up, and those who didn't.
Yes.
And what was your own view in mid-2015 as to what the term filler or term filler material, etc., meant?
A filler is something which is, in my view at the time, applied to a building system, whatever, afterwards to make up a gap. One thinks of polyfiller, it's used to fill your cracks before you decorate it. There are various options, I guess interpretations of where you could use it, what could be termed a filler, but that was kind of my understanding of what it meant by a filler material. It was something along those lines.
Was it your understanding that the presence of that word in 12.7 was what meant that all elements of an external wall build-up, including external facings, had to be a material of limited combustibility?
No, my view is it was the word etc.
As you told us yesterday.
Indeed.
Now, Steve Evans refers, as presumably your draft does, to NHBC coming across a large number of cladding finishes that were not materials of limited combustibility. Can you give us an idea of scale? What did you mean by large number?
It's hard to put a figure on it. I mean, I would say at the time there was an awful lot of buildings were using a brick finish, and probably 50% or more were probably brick. So of all the others, that was when we were into this variety of different products. Some of those were steel, aluminium, which were MOLC. It was only when you got down to your Trespers, your ACMs, some of your rock panels, and some of the more, resin-bound cladding systems. If I was to put a figure, I'd probably say about a third of the external cladding materials we were seeing, probably a third of those were probably not MOLC.
And was that, and I think it follows from your answer, that was projects on which NHBC were providing services?
Yes, albeit sometimes only the warranty rather than the building control.
Right. And was that discovery that result, I think the answer is no from what you said about the chronology, but just help me, was that discovery the result of NHBC's 2015 review of combustible materials?
No, I'd
Not.
already...
Now, Sarah Colwell, I think, had told you at the meeting that you'd had with her at the BRE in Watford on the 27th of November 2014 about her thoughts on external finishes, and they corresponded with yours, I think. Yes?
Yes, they did, yes.
And indeed, Tony Baker had done the same in his email of May 2013.
Indeed, yes.
Yes. And indeed, the BCA Technical Guidance 18 issue 0 from June 2014, a year before, had also corresponded with that view.
It did. It was our view all along.
Yeah. So why did the NHBC feel, given that history, that it was necessary to consult Brian Martin separately about this point and at length?
Well, I think because we'd made our own view, which we were pretty sure about. We'd been to BRE, who also had said, it was their view, but they were not the ones, that oversaw the building regulations, and approved document B, was a document issued by the ministry, and therefore I think Steve's view was, well, we haven't got it chapter and verse from the ministry, perhaps we should do that just to be, cover all bases. And that's why I believe that we'd done that. I mean, at this time, Steve particularly was getting an awful lot of kickback from the industry about why we were asking for the cladding finish to be MOLC when it was only the insulation. So I know Steve was under a lot of pressure at the time, and I suspect that could have contributed as well to him saying, let's just, get yet another layer of assurance that we are on the right track with this.
I see. So, to summarise your evidence on that, was it the case that between June 2014 and June 2015, there were elements of the industry who were reacting adversely to the breadth of option 1?
Yes, very much so.
Yes. Now, if we go to page 4 of this email chain, we can see Brian Martin's response the very next day, 16th of June, 2015, at 10:02 in the morning. And he says this: "Hi, Steve. I can't offer a formal view as such. Specific projects are a matter for the relevant building control body. As you say, the overarching objective is that the external envelope of a building should not provide for a medium for fire spread, and this is particularly important for a block of flats. People do sometimes try to play games with definitions, and where this happens, one should refer back to this objective. We came across one incident where an EPS foam was used to fill a void behind some aluminium sheeting. Because it was not included specifically for its thermal properties, the designers had concluded that it wasn't insulation, and thus its use was okay. When it caught fire, the flames could be seen across the city! ! That's why the reference to fillers, etc. was included in the AD text. Do you have some examples of specific constructions you've come across? It may be we could revise the text again or maybe test some of it. Best regards, Brian." What did you understand Brian Martin's role to be in relation to the wording of ADB?
My knowledge at the time was that, or my understanding was that Brian was, I thought, more or less the author of ADB. Obviously, it would have been via a committee, but it was certainly Brian's department that issued that document, and on that basis, they were the best people to go to for an interpretation of what they were meaning when by a certain clause in ADB.
Did you understand why his response was that he couldn't offer a formal view as such?
It was typical of the response we always got back from Brian, that his take on everything would always be, you're the building control body, you've got to interpret it in the way you see fit. This kind of fitted with that.
What did you think about that?
Well, we would have preferred obviously we would have preferred a straight answer, yes, no, that would have made all our lives easier because we would have known where we were. We were very much, trying to navigate our way through a system that had been set by the ministry in terms of the BR135, ADB, BBA certificates, and, building control bodies were kind of left on their own to navigate this route, to interpret it as they saw fit in the right way, and then to stand by that later on. And, it was not easy in many cases.
If the department's building regulations division couldn't offer a view, or certainly not a formal view, on the wording or meaning of particular clauses of ADB, who do you know who could? And what organisation would be able to do that?
There isn't one. It was left to ourselves to interpret it as we saw fit and to implement all of this process as we saw fit. The only thing set in stone was the functional requirement B41 in this case.
Now, you address Brian Martin's response in your witness statement. If we look at that and go please to page 19 at the foot of the page, paragraph 74, you say there in the second sentence, in my view, you say ACM was not directly addressed by either document. You see that. And then you go on to say the closest was that ADB referred to filler, which in theory could have been the core of an ACM panel. However, I did not consider this to be the case. An email from Brian Martin from MHCLG dated 16th June 2015, which we've just seen, suggests he shares this view. And then over the page to page 20, Mr. Martin indicated that the reference to filler was to address filler being placed behind insulation, such as polystyrene filler, to take up the gaps. Given that Mr. Martin headed the ADB review process, I was comfortable we were focusing on the correct issue. However, irrespective of the wording in ADB, I was clear in my own mind that the manner and rate at which 100% PE cord ACM burned could not be interpreted as meeting the wording of Regulation B41. Now, just to be clear, is it right, you didn't think the wording in ADB was clear, and you essentially made your own decision, or came to your own conclusion, that B4 related to all elements of the external wall, even though it didn't explicitly say so?
Yes, and to back that up, the words we put when 9991 was up for review, we put to them, the words which he made specifically that it did include the external cladding panel.
Yes.
And they were incorporated into the later version of 9991.
And Steve Evans told us that he'd always thought, he'd always had that view, regardless of what filler meant. Was that also your understanding?
Yes, we were clear. We knew what we thought, yes.
Yes. Did you know which project Brian Martin was referring to in his email when he refers to the EPS foam being used to fill a void?
At the time, no, I just assumed it was one in London.
Right.
I think it was actually one in Manchester.
The Edge, Salford, 2005.
That's what I believe from this inquiry.
Right, not from your involvement at the time.
No.
I follow. Now, you say in paragraph 74, as we've seen, irrespective of the wording in which, in ADB, I was clear in my own mind that the manner and rate at which 100% PE covered ACM burned could not be interpreted as meeting the wording of Regulation B4. Just at the end there. Are you saying that 100% PE cord aluminium could never be used in any situation, as it would always fail to satisfy the functional requirement, whichever route to compliance was adopted?
Yes, from what we'd seen of the way it burnt, I couldn't see how ever you could say, you had inhibited fire spread across a building.
So, just to be clear, your own view at the time, this is mid-June 2015, was PE cord ACM would always fail to satisfy the functional requirement, whichever route to compliance one tried.
Yes.
And the basis for that view was what?
Simply from evidence of fires around the world that had that stuff used.
And was that a view you shared with others at NHBC?
Yes, yeah.
Who?
At the time I was carrying out various presentations to internally to the surveyors and some external ones. It was something that I always stated in the presentation to the surveyors, that along the lines of, if anybody puts it to you with 100% PE cord ACM, just knock it back immediately. There's no way that we're really going to consider that could meet building regulations.
Right. And when did that instructional advice to surveyors start being given by you?
Well, it would have been, after we wrote the first guidance note and the first edition of the BCA guidance note, once that was going, then I believe that was when I toured the country meeting the various surveying teams presenting on this. So it would have been, I can't put dates on it, but, you know, it was during this period, you know, probably more 2015, maybe late 2014 as well,
Right.
around that time.
Okay. And had you seen, or were you beginning to see any desktops through option 3 that had approved the use of 100% PE called ACM?
We were, yes.
And knocking those back as well on the basis that their use could never satisfy the functional requirement?
Under option 3, yes.
Yes. So even option 3 wouldn't avail a building owner or architect if they chose to use ACM with a 100% PE core?
Not in our view. I mean,
Right.
you know, as we saw, if we were getting this put on option 3, we were rejecting it.
Now, can we go back up the email chain, please, to page 3? I think we can take this quite quickly, given your evidence. Page 3, we see that on the 17th of June 2015, Steve Evans forwards his email and Brian Martin's response to you and says, John, not a very clear answer, indeed not an answer at all. I think you agree with that, but did you consider going back to Brian Martin? Did you and Steve Evans consider going back to him and asking for a clearer answer, or an answer, on this issue?
I think we felt that that was the clearest answer we were likely to get. Brian generally was consistent, from what I understood, that, you know, he didn't want to get involved in policy decisions between building control bodies.
I mean, it's an awful lot of work that went into that email, and an awful lot of very clear, if I may say so, clear description of the problem. Why did you take his riposte as final and not go back to him and see if you could tease out a little bit more?
Well, we kind of took that, you know, the inference of what he'd written was that we were on the right lines. He just, for some reason, you know, wasn't going to state that in black and white. But we kind of, you know, read it that he thought we were right. And that was, you know, as much as we would probably get from him.
Right. Let's go up to page 2. We can see your response. And you say this, yes, a clearer answer would have helped. However, interpreting his response, can I suggest, 1, filler materials have been made a bit more clear. A plywood backing to a metal finish would, I guess, be one such example. Actually, it's quite useful to now know what the definition of filler material is. 2, Brian says that the overarching objective is that the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread, and that if in doubt we should refer back to this objective, so it surely has to include the external cladding material. Question mark. An example being that we'd be reluctant to accept timber cladding, which only has a class 0 SSOF, I think that's surface spread of flame,
Indeed.
but which would allow flame spread when acted upon by a large flame plume. Is this enough to hang our hat on? Surely we should let H&H play devil's advocate on it. They're usually quite good at arguing these things. Now, was there a specific situation that the two of you had been discussing about whether the definition of filler or filler material, etc., applied?
Not that I recall specifically. I mean, we were not really clear what a filler material was in the context of most of the facade systems we were seeing. But I don't recall there was a particular job that was, you know, dictating that. You know, our as I say, you know, we just based more on the etc. than we did on the filler.
Right.
components.
What did you mean by, is that enough for us to hang our hat on?
That I think, you know, we've asked this question of various people now enough times. Surely we've got enough evidence from various parts of the industry to confirm that our interpretation that the external cladding panel needs to be a material limited combustibility, it was, you know, it was that.
Now, Steve Evans in his witness statement says, and I don't think we need to take you to it, it's paragraph 287E, Roman 7 on page 115, but he addresses the reference to H&H, and he says that was a reference to H&H being a fire engineer who would act on behalf of builders on various projects, and it would try and push the interpretation that the ACM core was neither filler nor insulation. That's what he says in his statement. Do you agree?
That was the sort of argument that we were getting back from various places.
Right.
Yes.
And H&H was a paradigm, was it? A good example.
Yes, I would think. Yes, I think it was, because I recall Yes, it was, because Steve at some point, and I can't remember the timeline, had been in a meeting with H&H where their argument was that a 100% PE cord used with a mineral wool insulation would be acceptable under ADB. And I know that Steve, he came out of that meeting quite, wound up. It had obviously, it'd been a contentious meeting.
Right. Did it concern you that fire engineers like H&H were pushing this interpretation of ADB?
Yes.
Yes. Now, Brian Martin asks in his email for Steve Evans to respond with specific constructions that he'd come across. Now, we can't see the email at the top of the chain because it's been redacted, but were you aware of his response, if any, to this request from Brian Martin?
Did he copy me in on it?
Well, I don't know. I'm asking you, do you know whether he responded?
I don't think I'm not aware of a response.
Right.
I don't recall one, no.
You say you don't remember Steve Evans going back to Brian Martin and giving him specific examples?
I don't recall it, no.
I'd like now to turn to 2016 and NHBC's guidance note. First, the NHBC conference on the 7th of July 2016, entitled Facades to Tall Buildings. And you cover this in your statement at paragraph 193, page 53. And let's just look at that. 193, bottom of page 53. And let's scroll up a little bit to the middle of page 53 to see the main heading there. The main heading is NHBC Guidance Note, Acceptability of Common Wall Construction Containing Combustible Materials in High-Rise Buildings, the 2016 Guidance. And then there's some italics, reasons for the 2016 Guidance Note. And then you say this, due to the change in policy mentioned above at paragraph 91, which I should just tell you is where you set out, we saw it earlier, the requirement to comply with the BCA Technical Guidance Note 18. NHBC had put a condition on all projects for which it was providing building control and or warranty cover for and which were over 18 metres. This meant that the projects underwent an additional fire safety review process within NHBC before final approval was obtained. There was a formal escalation process where, after I'd approved it as the fire engineer, it went to Steve Evans for approval and then to senior manager, such as Ian Davis, who was an NHBC director at the time, for final sign-off. And at 194, you say, what this meant in practice was that we were holding up the final sign-off on many projects with the escalation process. Also, as the vast majority of these projects were obtaining option 3 assessment, we were seeing significant numbers of very similar reports for ACM, brickwork and timber. In essence, the fire engineers were issuing almost the same report again and again with minor variations, and it had been made clear by Kingspan that no further large-scale testing was planned. Why was the focus on Kingspan?
Mainly because they were the ones that we'd had most discussions with, and they were the ones that were, we weren't seeing a lot of traction with them in terms of doing more fire testing, but they were the only ones really that were at the time or had been proposing to do more, testing more scenarios.
Was it the case that because there was to be no further large-scale testing proposed by Kingspan, you needed an avenue to approve their product in different build-ups?
Well, that was the option 3 process to do that. We didn't produce this guidance note to give yet another avenue, no.
But the option 3 process would depend on data, and you only had data from, 3 tests?
Yes, and we were hitting this kind of stalemate situation where Kingspan said, we only sell insulation, we've done all these fire tests, we're not doing any more, go and target the people that make other materials and ask them to do some fire tests.
So this guidance note was in part a response to that, was it?
It was in response to this plateau situation that we'd reached, that, nobody was proposing any more 8414 testing. We weren't aware of any happening, and all we were seeing was a rehash of the same stuff from the fire engineers, based on the evidence pool that was already there.
Right. Now, when you say there were minor variations, you say the fire engineers were issuing almost the same report again and again with minor variations. What were the minor variations?
Just, with regards to that material changes and slight differences in the way it was fixed. Thickness of the insulation could be 5mm, 10mm wider, thinner, things like that.
What was your criteria? What were your criteria for establishing whether the variations were minor?
Because we knew the tests, I knew the tests, and we would look at, what they were writing, and I knew the type of, I knew the types of sheathing board that had been used, and that would change. I knew the thicknesses of the insulation. We knew that changed. We knew the thickness of the cavity widths. We would look at things like that. The way the cladding panels were fixed, usually that was an aluminium. It didn't change very often, but it could change from aluminium to steel. There were things like that. But, all of those within reason were probably not going to particularly adversely affect the performance of a cladding system in the test.
When you say all of those within reason were probably not going to particularly adversely affect performance, what was the scientific basis, or was there a scientific basis on which you could assess the impact in fire of what you call a minor variation on each build-up that you were seeing to an acceptable level of confidence?
Well, I didn't hold. This is where I have to, be honest, that I didn't hold that level of, of expertise, and quite honestly, I probably shouldn't have been doing this and trying to do this process.
So the answer, I think, is none.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, does that mean that, in fact, being honest with us, you had no scientific or objective basis for being able to say with any kind of confidence how each of these changes to the system proposed would affect its performance in fire?
All I had was, what I'd learnt from reading the Option 3 reports, which were coming in from people like BRE and Exover, and things like that. I was reading theirs and interpreting it, combining that with the best of the knowledge that I did have, and forming a view based on that. Did
you tell your seniors, did you tell Steve Evans that was what you were doing?
Well, yes, they knew my qualifications, and they did know that, yes.
Did they know about the reservations that you've just very candidly expressed to us?
Probably not, no. I don't know if I sort of said, this is the limit of my knowledge. I don't know if I explained that to them at the time.
Do you know why? We have no evidence that you actually did. Do you know, if that's right, why you didn't?
Why I didn't mention it to them?
Yes.
Because they already knew what how much my expertise, where it went, how far it went.
Going on to paragraph 195 on page 54, you say at the top there, based on the reports we had received through the formal escalation process, we could see that we would always get the same results. Therefore, we intended to tell our builders that for specific wall makeups where we had already seen numerous Option 3 assessments, we had sufficient existing information to be able to know what a further Option 3 report would say. Now, when you say results, results of what?
These were, the results of, basically what was going to be written in the Option 3 report. We knew that it had got to the point, perhaps if I explain the rationale behind why the guidance note came into existence, which was initially that we had no route to compliance for a brick facade other than to make the builder go through an Option 3 report process on every scheme to justify the use of a brick facade with a lightweight steel frame construction. And that was the basis of the guidance note originally, was, surely there was no need to make everybody go through this and tie up the likes of Exover to write this report just for that type of thing. And that was the original idea behind it.
What was the problem with the brick? Brick, to my knowledge, isn't combustible, is it?
No, but it didn't meet the Option 1 route because, you could only use combustible insulation if it had a blockwork inner leaf, which we didn't see on new build. It was lightweight steel frame. Option 2, it had never been tested, so there was no route to compliance for a brick facade with Kingspan on a lightweight steel frame. So therefore, it was down to option 3, and we were insisting that people basically got an option 3 report written for something which was quite obvious to most people that was going to comply.
Well, there are a lot of variables, aren't there?
Yeah.
I mean, did you ever think that even if the brick outer skin was not combustible itself, the dimensions of the cavity might come into play, partly because the brick would trap the heat more than some other things?
We weighed all that up, but in most buildings, you have concrete frame, the floor slabs come across, and then you have a cavity barrier between the slab edge and the brickwork. So your insulation is only confined to a story height, sandwiched between, 2 floor slab edges and brickwork on the external face. On that basis, the width of the cavity would not particularly make a great deal of difference to, if it burnt. If it did burn, it would only be 1 story height that would be burnt, trapped behind brickwork.
Yeah. I mean, just following the logic of your example through, was that a thought you had at the time? I mean, you've given this as a historical reason for the origin of this.
No, that was
guidance.
why, this is why the 2016 guidance note came into existence,
Right.
initially to tackle the brickwork scenario.
Did you, given that thought, did you not think then of revisiting option 1 and asking yourself whether in fact it was right that all elements of the external wall build-up needed to be materials of limited combustibility, because your brick example might be one where that interpretation was impracticable and unnecessary?
But option 1 was written in, in ADB. It was taken from there.
Well, it was controversial, as you told us.
But it was clear in ADB that you could only use, brick with a blockwork backing wall and use combustible insulation in the cavity.
Now, so the answer is no, you didn't consider it, because it would be the wrong approach.
We couldn't do it.
Right.
No.
Now, you say you would always get the same results here. Did you stop to consider the possibility that the reason why you were getting so many, quotes, same results, unquotes, was because of how you'd set up your risk analysis system in the first place?
In what way?
Well, did you consider that it might have been because your system of escalation and analysis was too insensitive to small but potentially important variations in build-up in relation to things like materials, quantities, dimensions, fixings?
We were not. I mean, I was going through each of these option 3 reports from, EXO, BRE, whoever. They were not. I was reading them in depth. They were not saying anything about those issues that you said. They were boiling down to, if you have a Class B material on the outside face, then, if it's Class B materials used with Kingspan K15 on a lightweight steel frame were tending to, they would perform okay, and that was what we were getting back in terms of the option 3 reports. And that was based on the fact that, there was test data at that point for the Trespa test, which was not Class B, but it was other. And there was a test on Korea cladding, which was a Class B material. And there was other evidence as well from NFPA 285 tests on Class B.
Korea not a composite, though, was it?
Korea is a composite material. I believe it's a resin-bound sort of mineral wrapped up in resin.
So when I say composite, I mean not a PE composite.
No, it's not an ACM, no.
Now, considering you had concerns over many of the option 3 assessments that you'd received, did you not think that removing option 3 as a step entirely from the building control or warranty process was irresponsible?
Well, by this point, we hadn't, as far as I could make out, ever been able to reject a building. there'd been some buildings where there'd been other works needed. The one building which we were adamant was very unsafe, we only had it for warranty, and they just withdrew the warranty and took it with someone else. The building never changed. You know, we were at this point where we weren't achieving anything. We weren't able to stop buildings being built with these materials on. We were just, you know, it wasn't not exactly a rubber stamp exercise, but it was becoming that, you know, there was not a body of evidence, and the reports were not looking in more depth at new evidence coming forward. It was just plateauing out. On the back of all of this, there were very few. By this point, most developers had said, we're not going through this hassle again. You know, we're going to build with materials of limited combustibility. So we were seeing a distinct tail off in the use of, you know, these sort of needed for these reports.
Did that experience not demonstrate to you that option 3 either didn't work or had severe limitations?
I was of the view at that point that this whole process was not... Well, no, it had achieved results, you know, but because we'd steered a lot of new up-and-coming buildings down a different route of a safer route, and we'd hopefully educated a lot of people as to what all this was about. But in terms of groundbreaking new changes, nothing was coming about.
Well, let's just look at one of the option 3, well, some of the option 3 reports you refer to as part of the significant number you looked at in preparation for the 2016 guidance note. NHB 401408. This is an option 3 report completed by H&H Fire for Bellway Homes on the 21st of April 2016. And the development was Barking Site G, as you can see, cores G, NO1 and O2. And if we go to the bottom of page 6 and the top of page 7, you can see the tested systems arrangements which were used in producing the assessment. And if you go to the top of page 7, you can see that 4 BS 8414 tests are referred to there, yes?
Yes.
They work across the page, and the numbers are there, and the test numbers and details. And these are all tests sponsored by Kingspan for K15, aren't they?
Yes.
And the insulation proposed at Barking Site G was K15, yes?
I can't recall, but more than likely.
Yes, well, I mean, I think we could probably get that from the middle column. External cavity insulation,
Agreed.
K15, 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 and then K18, but that should be 15, that's a typo. Take that from me. I don't think there is such a thing as K18. Were you aware in 2016 when H&H's report for Bellway Homes was written, the third test referred to there, the Trespa high pressure laminate test, number 293940, was a failed test?
Yes, we knew that.
You did?
Yes.
Did H&H know that it was a failed test?
Yes, I mean, BRE refused to issue a BR135 for that test.
Indeed. And we don't see anywhere we've seen in this report where H&H mentioned that fact. Do you accept that on its face, the reader of this wouldn't know that?
No, because H&H were fire engineers. As I say, you read the report, you saw it was terminated early. If you knew BS 8414, you know, the terms under which early termination of a test, you know, that was all there. They knew it. I'm sure they knew it. But you know, failed test did still reveal useful data.
Should H&H not have set out the basis on which they were relying on data from a failed test?
Well, we didn't have set parameters of how we expected them to write these. You know, we left it up to them to, you know, provide an expert report.
Were you aware of how the failed test on a Trespa laminate sample gave confidence to the report writer and allowed them to compare it with a system using, for example, Reynobond ACM?
Well, it did reveal data in terms of, you know, I mean, a lot of this was you compare between these reports. You'd look I mean, by comparison with that one with the terracotta report, a lot of the build-up is largely the same up until the point of the K15. Then the cavity width is slightly different and the external finish was different. One of those tests passed BR135, one of them didn't. That would allow a fire engineer to then home into why one passed, why one didn't, and to what effect, what extent the test was affected by the TRESPA panel.
Well, let's look at this. I mean, you can see if you go to page 8 that under paragraph 2.1.1, the following external wall types have been identified for this project. And then the first one is brick cladding and Reynobond cladding, indicated as green in the figures below, and you need to scroll down page 8 to see the green. Let's do that. You can see where it was on the building, where on the west elevation there was Reynobond, you see?
Yes.
And if you go to page 15 and following, you have the fourth kind, which is Reynobond rain screen cladding, and Reynobond's misspelled, it doesn't matter. General, this type has not been tested to BS 8414 to determine whether it meets the performance criteria of BR135, but will be assessed based on option 3 of the BCA technical guidance note, i.e. a desktop study to consider whether similar testing can be extrapolated to conclude that if tested, the proposed build-ups would be expected to achieve at the BR135 performance criteria. Yes?
Yes.
And then if you look at the next page...
Could I just point out on that image there?
Yes.
There was a blockwork. The Reynobond was fixed to a blockwork.
Well, exactly. That's the point I was going to make.
Okay.
Given that it's fixed to a blockwork there, it's not a vented cavity, is it?
No.
No.
Well, yes, the cavity between the back of the Reynobond and the front of the blockwork is a vented cavity.
It's very small.
It's 65 mil.
And then on page 16, assessment against tested systems, and you can see what's said under external cladding and support systems there. You see that?
Which paragraph, sorry?
4.3.
Yes.
And then 4.3.1, 4.3.2 and 4.3.3.
Yes.
Identify the difference between the testing arrangements and the proposed arrangements found in the cladding materials. The tested cladding systems were either a 30mm thick terracotta clay tile or a 6mm thick cement particle board, each system supported upon aluminium railings, whereas the proposed cladding was a 100mm blockwork system with a Reynobond screen. Just pausing there. They're a bit different, aren't they?
Yes, they are, but the incorporation of a blockwork would generally, lead to a fire engineer to consider that was going to perform better than the tested arrangement.
I think that's what they say in the next two paragraphs, isn't it?
Mm.
And the third paragraph, although the cladding materials will not propagate fire, it can be seen from the results of the tested systems and from other BS 8414 tests that the cladding systems can play a positive role in shielding combustible insulation, as such, the integrity and thermal resistance of the cladding are considered further in this assessment below. Now, what do you know, and what were the reaction to fire properties of this Reynobond panel, which allowed credible technical comparison between the failed TRESPA test and that of the proposed system?
The TRESPA was a Class D. The Reynobond system, the FR version of Reynobond, was a Class B. We knew that from the Reynobond data sheet, and in this job we went back to site to say, please can you confirm exactly which version of Reynobond was supplied to site, to check that it was the FR version rather than the 100% PE code version.
Well, that's exactly right. They hadn't specified what type of Reynobond cladding was being used, PE or FR, had they?
They hadn't, no.
So as a standalone, this is, in that sense, useless.
Well, this is why we went back. We went back and said, tell us exactly which one has been used. Was
it only the fact that this was a Class B panel that gave you, assuming it to be, because of FR, assuming it to be FR, that gave you confidence that it was going to behave the same as a TRESPA panel without knowing anything about its surface spread of flame properties or heat of combustion, or matters of that nature?
We'd seen the various Option 3 assessments using a Class B fire-resisting mineral mix PE core panels, we'd seen those justified several times by, various bodies. So, we looked at this one and said, well, if that panel was directly in front of the insulation, that's the sort of option 3 assessment that we've seen many a time from, well, not many a time, but several times from Exover. In this particular case, it's got a blockwork into liner as well. So most likely it's going to perform at least as well as what we'd already seen carried out under the 841, under the option 3s.
Did you have any misgivings about H&H relying on the 4th test we've seen, which was the UAC cement particle board in test 220876, which was the 2005 Kingspan K15 test using the cementitious particle board?
Well, again, the fire engineering people would all look at each of those and, make this a judgment as to at what point in the test did the panels fail and open up the cavity and let the fire get to the insulation.
Yes, but it was using a rain screen made of thick cementitious particle board. Did you not have any misgivings about the fact that H&H were relying on that test when applying it to this rain screen?
Not as such, because we knew that material heated up and shattered and opened up in large chunks.
What comparative judgments can one make as between a cement particle board on the one hand and a Renabond ACM panel, FR or PE, on the other?
One of them, the cement board would heat up, shatter, open up a large area. The A Class B ACM would heat up in the zone of the flame plume and open up a large area. It was a comparison, a fine line judgment between how those two things would, those two situations would occur.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. I think we've done enough for today, Mr. Lewis, but I'm afraid that means we're going to have to ask you to come back tomorrow for a short period of time to finish your evidence. I hope you were warned of that.
Yes, indeed, I was.
Sorry if it's inconvenient, but there are a few more questions that we need to put to you. So we'll resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I imagine Mr. Lewis can hope to be free before lunch.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. It may depend on what further questions we discover overnight, and what questions others wish me to put.
Well, it sounds as though you can certainly hope to get away by lunchtime, and we'll let you get away, of course, as soon as we can. Anyway, now we're going to stop, and please remember not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, and we'll look forward to seeing you at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.